Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we are going to be going over some of the most terrifying ghost stories from around the web. We are currently on Volume 3 of this series. If you enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Now, let's get into the fearful findings. A bad move. This is a true accounting of events that occurred between November 2012 and January 2013. This is not a contrived or exaggerated recount. I want to preface that I am a recovering addict and had been clean for 2 years and 3 months when the occurrences began. Because I choose to maintain my anonymity as a recovering addict, in keeping with the traditions and principles of my program, I do not use my real name, nor do I use the actual names of anyone included in this recording. I am a college graduate and a career professional, but I will not disclose specifics in these areas either. I will use actual geographical locations but will not disclose the address of the location where this story takes place. I am a very spiritual person, and it was my faith that saved my life. My faith and my mom are my recovery family. I was 43 years old when the events occurred. In November 2012, after a painful breakup with my partner of 10 years, I, along with my 7-year-old black Labrador retriever, Sora, moved out of the 2,500 square foot house that I owned with my former partner, because we had put it on the market, and into one side of a duplex that was just east of downtown Orlando. The ranch-style red brick, 2-bedroom unit was perfect. I recall feeling a sense of accomplishment in finding a place so close to downtown, especially because the rental rate was surprisingly low considering the location and the space. I was less than a mile from the heart of downtown, on the outskirts of the highly desirable Eola Heights. Less than half a block away, there was a beautiful city park that was maintained by the Orlando Horticulture Society, perfect for my morning and evening walks with Sora. Plus, the duplex had a fenced backyard that was perfect for those times when it was easier to just open the back door and let my precious pup out to do her business. The duplex was built in the late 1940s. The place had never been renovated and still had the original terrazzo floors, bathroom tiles, with stained kitchen cabinets, etc. But it had been very well maintained, and, while outdated, it had a classic charm about it. The day that I signed the lease, Mike, the guy from the property management company, informed me that they would not be leasing out the other side of the duplex anytime soon. He didn't offer an explanation, and frankly, I was so thrilled over the fact that I would have privacy and wouldn't have to deal with anyone else on the property that I didn't ask why. The only thought that came to mind was that there would be no complaints if I failed to scoop the poop on occasion. If I had company, there would be no nosy neighbor minding my business. I could play my music as loud as I wished. If Sora barked, there would be no complaints. It represented freedom, privacy, and a sense of pride in knowing that I had found such a great place that was so affordable in a great location. Finding the place helped to somewhat ease the pain of the breakup and gave me a sense of independence. It was the first time in my life that I would live alone, without another human, that is. I loved Sarah. She was my best friend and a great companion. And she enjoyed the fact that I started to let her jump up into my bed and sleep next to me at night, and she loved the walks in the nearby park. I was so close to downtown and on a somewhat busy street. There was a fair amount of foot traffic. There was not a lot of foot traffic at night, but enough so that the sound of people conversing as they walked by never struck me as odd. I simply accepted it as part of living close to downtown. I kept my curtains closed all the time because I was close enough to the sidewalk that nosy passersby could see inside my house. A couple of weeks after I had moved in, it occurred to me that every night, at around 11 p.m., I would hear what seemed to be the same voices engaged in the same undiscernible conversation. After about a week, my curiosity demanded that I see who these creatures of habit were, and at 11 p.m., I positioned myself by the front door. Like clockwork at 11 p.m. on the dot, the same voices having the same muffled conversation could be heard starting at one end of the sidewalk in front of my duplex as I walked towards downtown. When I heard them talking, I started to open my front door, but as soon as I started to turn the doorknob, the conversation abruptly stopped. I opened the door and stepped out onto the front porch. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely terrified. It just didn't make sense. There were no people at all. Not on the sidewalk, not on the street. It was just silent. I didn't even hear the cars driving the busy stretch of East Colonial Drive, just a few blocks away. That was the night that things started to happen. It started with my precious dog. The sight of Sora retreating to the corner of the living room, farthest from the front door, where her whole body was trembling, is burned into my memory. I had to pick her up and carry her to the bedroom that night. That was also the night that the 11 p.m. voices stopped. But that's also the night when the really frightening things started up. What happened next convinced me that I was having genuine paranormal experiences. I decided to start keeping a journal of my experiences. They started happening at all hours of the day and night. This is the order in which the first occurrences happened. Saturday morning, November 10th, 2012. Between 10:05 and 10:10 a.m., vacuuming my living room rug, the vacuum cleaner cut off. Then I heard the voice of an elderly-sounding man, as if only a couple of feet away from me, say, "What are you doing?" Then the vacuum cut back on. I ran out of the house, calling Sarah to follow me. I wouldn't go back into the house until my NA sponsor came over 3 hours later. Tuesday morning, November 13th, 2012. Approximately 1:20 a.m., awakened by the sound of something crashing onto the floor in the kitchen. It sounded like a stack of plates. I got up to investigate the cause and found that every light in the house was on, except for my bedroom light. Wednesday morning, November 14th, 2012. Approximately 1:30 a.m., I had recorded myself turning off all the lights throughout the house before going to bed. I was awakened again by what sounded like a stack of plates crashing to the floor. The lights in the living room and kitchen were on. I got up and turned them off. As I climbed into bed, both the kitchen and living room lights came on again. I continued to document the strange occurrences, but would just write down the dates, times, then say, same as last night, unless there was a change, like the night that the lights in the living room turned on and off for about 10 minutes. By this time, I had gotten over my trepidation about sharing these experiences with the people I knew. I started to tell close friends about what I was experiencing, and much to my relief, the overwhelming response was loving and supportive. A friend of mine from my recovery program suggested that I have the duplex blessed and introduced me to an ordained minister from a nearby Unitarian church. I gratefully accepted my friend's offer to appeal to the minister to perform the blessing. And on Saturday, December 9th, 2012, 2 ministers and 3 of my friends from the program came over and prayed and performed a blessing, then a sort of spiritual cleansing with sage. The ritual and prayer seemed to work. All unusual activities were stopped. I had a great Christmas in my new digs and felt a tremendous sense of relief. Sarah seemed to be returning to her normal playful self. It really seemed that everything was going to be all right. Until the night of January 10th, 2013. I have gone over it again and again, trying to figure out what it was that caused the whole experience to start again. It was as if I was watching a movie again, complete with the 11 p.m. phantom pedestrians. That night, starting at 11:15 p.m., I called everyone who had been part of the blessing and cleansing. They all, in turn, agreed to come back the next weekend. The next day, I called the property management company and spoke to Mike, the property manager, and the person who had done the lease signing with me. I asked him how long the unit I had rented had been vacant before I moved in, why wasn't the other unit being leased, and if previous tenants had ever said anything about strange things happening in the unit. He only answered my first question before saying he had an important call and would get back to me. It was around this date that I started to get sick. Not like a cold or stomachache sick, but seriously painfully ill. I developed, almost overnight, ulcerative colitis. Even though I didn't have Crohn's disease, it was debilitating. It affected every aspect of my life. Then the infection came. This went on for weeks and caused me to have to take an extended medical leave of absence because I was put on 4 antibiotics. I was never one to get sick. I worked out daily, ate healthy, and got plenty of rest, at least prior to moving into this duplex. Overall, I was a very active and healthy person, especially since I had started my journey in recovery. My doctor was perplexed as to why my health had taken such a drastic turn. Then it happened. I was physically attacked. It was January 28th. I was pushed while stepping out of the tub. I fell to the floor. I've never been so scared. I started praying the Lord's Prayer and the 23 Psalms intermittently, over and over, bowled up in a fetal position. I was terrified and had reached my breaking point. Almost as if on cue, my dear friend Rico called me. I got to my cell phone, and I was crying. The only thing I heard from Rico was, "Here's the deal. I am coming to see you right now, and if you have plans, cancel them. This is urgent. I'll be there in 2 hours. I'll explain when I get there, and are you okay, by the way?" Rico lived in Tampa. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since the weekend that I moved into the duplex. Rico was the type who visited his psychic every week. He would frequently include comments like, "Well, Laura, his psychic, said I must do this," or "Laura told me not to do insert activity here," or "Oh my God, she said this would happen." I adored Rico. I think that, had I not been in a relationship when I first met him, I definitely would have pursued him. Whenever we were around each other, it was an amazing time. I dressed quickly and grabbed Sola's leash. I drove to a nearby dog park and waited for Rico to call. I was not going back into the house alone. Rico called 2 hours later to tell me he'd arrived. He used my hidden spare key to get into my unit. When I got back to the house, I walked into the back door and called to Rico, who responded, "Do not close the back door." The smell of sage filled my whole house. I walked into the hallway, and there was Rico and some woman that I had never seen before. Rico was waving his hands over a smoking roll of sage. He walked up to me, staring me in the eyes. "Paul, this is Laura." Laura walked over and threw her arms around me. Then she leaned down and, looking at Sora, said, "Why, yes, girl, we are here to help," as if she were responding to a direct question from Sora. Rico went on to tell me that when he arrived at Laura's house that morning, the only thing she said was for him to go to his friend Paul and that she was coming along. She told Rico that Paul was in danger and they had to sage Paul's house. Not just once, but a few times, and to get a priest to bless the house. Rico then told me, "Paul, I've never spoken your name to her before. She always asked that I never give names so that her visions can be validated. When she said your name, I was already walking towards the door. What you are going through isn't a haunting, Paul. There is an evil here that will not stop inflicting harm until it is banished or destroyed. This is going to take so much more than I can do," Laura explained. Then just as she finished speaking, I started feeling extremely nauseated. Sarah ran out the back door to the far end of the backyard and started trembling. Then, right in front of me, Rico and Laura, in broad daylight, two of the kitchen cabinets opened, and the contents started falling out of the cabinets. I looked at both Rico and Laura. Both were terrified. Laura started praying, "Heavenly Father, send your angels. Please protect us." Then I heard that same disembodied voice the day that my vacuum cleaner turned off and on. This time, Rico and Laura heard it too. It said the same thing. "What are you doing?" Another cabinet door swung open, then slammed shut. The voice spoke again, but it was different. You know how Hollywood always portrays the voice when someone is possessed? They kind of got it right. It was like that. It was the voice of evil. It was malevolent. It screamed, "What are you doing?" I stood there trembling, looking at the cabinets, weak and nauseated. I don't recall if it was Laura or Rico that grabbed my hand, and in all candor, until I started writing about the experience, I hadn't thought about that moment. Only that I was pulled in the direction of the back door and out into the backyard, and that I was feeling more nauseated, and that I was hyperventilating. I don't recall passing out either. I only recall waking up in the hospital. I woke up and immediately realized that I was in a hospital bed. I felt the sphygmomanometer cuff on my right arm, and the 4 needle was inserted and taped to the top of my left hand. I tried to call out for Sora, but my throat was dry, and nothing came out. My mom was sitting in a chair next to the hospital bed. She stood up and grabbed the call remote, then walked quickly to the hospital room door and called out, "He's waking up. Come quick, please." It's blurry and difficult to remember exactly what happened after that, other than nurses coming in and asking me if I knew where I was and if I knew my name. But once I had been assessed and was given a cup of ice water, the nurses left the room to find out if I could be cleared for dietary. My head started to clear. The reason I passed out and was now lying in a hospital bed was that the infection had gotten worse, and I was dehydrated and malnourished. In the days just prior to the attack, I hadn't eaten or drank anything or administered the 4 antibiotics. Oh yeah, I forgot to include the part where I had to have a picture line inserted and had ripped it out the first night that I was in the hospital. I had a prescription for 4 antibiotics, the kind that are in a ball and push the fluids into the picture line. I had to keep them refrigerated, and I was supposed to be self-administering 3 times a day. I digress. I had been consumed by what I was going through, and my life had started falling apart. I was circling the drain at a rate 10 times faster than when I had been in active addiction. Mom took my hand and told me that she had already visited me twice and had picked up Sarah and taken her home, to Mom's house. Once Mom was sure that I was coherent, she squeezed my hand and pressed her other hand against my cheek. She stared into my eyes. I could see tears in hers. Then she told me that I was never to go back into that house. I remember feeling such a tremendous sense of relief and crying, no, bawling. My mom hugged me, then sat with me until I fell asleep. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Mom picked me up. I really wasn't paying attention to where we were until we turned onto the street where the duplex was. I thought. I started to speak, but then, as we pulled up to the duplex, I saw my two brothers and their pickup trucks, several people from my program, and a U-Haul. I am not exaggerating when I say that it took less than 30 minutes for everything that I had in that house to be removed and loaded onto the trucks. We caravanned to the house I owned with my former partner, who was waiting at the house when we all pulled up. He had picked up my Jeep and parked it in the garage. Tim, my ex, met me at the car door. As I stepped out of the car, he hugged me. This doesn't mean we are getting back together, but I do love you, and you gave everybody a real scare. This is where you belong for now. I laughed, thinking to myself, you have no idea what a real scare is. Within a week, my health had started to return. The ulcerative colitis was gone, as were the infections. I forgot to mention that Sola had started losing her fur. Within 3 weeks, her fur had grown back, and she was vibrant and healthy. I called the property management company and advised them that I had vacated the duplex and demanded my deposit back. I advised them that I had enough witnesses to attest to everything that happened to me. I was able to get the name and contact information of the people who had leased the unit before me, and they shared their experience with me. They had experienced the exact same things as I had. They had also done a bit of research. The property had a dark past that spanned decades. 3 suicides, a home invasion that resulted in 2 murders in the unit that wasn't rented. I was able to find a newspaper article about the home invasion. The property management company mailed my deposit and refunded me for 2 months' rent. What they did in not disclosing the properties in the past was unethical, and now, in most states, it's illegal. In the years since, I have avoided going anywhere near that property. If I was driving, I would detour around that stretch of road. The most important thing for me personally is that through the entire month-long episode, I stayed clean. My spiritual condition was solid. The duplex was raised in 2019. Birdseed. My grandmother was a nurse. She started in the Cadet Nurse Corps during World War II. After the war, she became an RN and spent the next 12 years working at her local hospital, mostly on the cardiac floor, but in other parts too if they needed her. She loved her job, but something bad happened with one of the doctors she worked under, and she saw no choice but to move on to somewhere else. Her next job was at a long-term care facility, a nursing home, to the uninitiated, where she worked for a lot of years until her retirement. My grandfather died before I was even thought of, so I never knew him outside of pictures and the stories my mom told me. Grandma didn't say much about him, but she never minded Mama talking about him. A few years after he passed, Grandma met a lady who worked at her favorite restaurant, Clovey, and Grandma and Clovey lived together for the rest of Grandma's life. Due to the times and it being the very Baptist South, everyone understood, but still, they were roommates. They did very well and kept the little farm my grandma and Pawpaw had bought in the family. They were even able to hire farmhands so they could both focus mostly on their own careers. Grandma had a lot of stories about strange goings-on at the hospital and at the nursing home. Even some she mentioned existed but said she'd never repeat. I'd like to share one now that touched my heart a bit. So if you're looking for something terrifying, this'll probably be boring for you. This one happened at the nursing home where she worked, and she was in her early 30s at the time. They had a resident, a man named Thomas. Thomas could talk but usually didn't. He was a slow-moving man who liked to wheel himself around and be at least an hour early for any meal or activity. He couldn't dress himself or tell you if he needed to pee or not. And she would laugh and tell about how she'd have to change his pants at least once per shift because she could never quite get his toileting schedule down, and he had what she called a 5-gallon drum for a bladder. Thomas had 2 bird feeders his kids had put outside his window. They bring a new 7-pound bag of birdseed almost every visit, with no regard for how much was already in his closet. At first, the maintenance guys took on the bird feeder responsibility, but after a few months, they decided they didn't have time and wouldn't be doing it anymore. One of the nurse's aides that worked with Grandma, Nellie, decided she'd take up the cost, so anytime Thomas's bird feeders got low, she'd bring his bag of birdseed out and refill them. Thomas would get a little down when he couldn't watch his birds at the feeders, so when Nellie took on the responsibility, everyone was glad to see him perk back up. Nellie took this seriously and never let those bird feeders run out. Grandma said she was a very sweet young woman and seemed to love nothing more than doing that little something extra to make the residents happy. She was reliable, always a few minutes early for her shift, and always happy to help her residents and her co-workers. And, as my mama always pointed out in this part of the story, the good die young. Nellie was only 23 when a drunk driver hit her head-on as she was on her way home, having stopped off at the grocery store after her shift. It was bad enough to be a closed casket funeral. But according to Mama, Nellie wasn't really gone. After a week or so, one of the nurses pointed out that they should probably refill the bird feeders because they'd have to be empty by now. They sent Nellie's replacement, Joanne, to get it taken care of, but Joanne looked out Thomas's window and returned to let them know that they were already full. And every time anyone checked, that was the case. No one took ownership of having filled them. They even asked the night shift folks, the administration, and the maintenance team that had refused to continue taking care of it to begin with. Eventually, they all started to joke that it must be Nellie's spirit taking care of Thomas's bird feeders. About 8 months after Nellie's death, Thomas died from a severe case of being 99 years old. His kids decided they'd donate the bird feeders and leave them where they were, and they left the bird seed in his closet. The feeders kept on getting filled, and still, no one would take credit for it. It wasn't long before a new resident moved into Thomas's room, and she enjoyed the bird feeders outside the window as well. But without Thomas's kids constantly restocking the seed, the supply in the closet eventually ran out. That's when the closet door started misbehaving. The new resident would often complain that her closet door must be broken because it would open and close on its own, sometimes really hard. The staff had no trouble believing it because it was a loud slamming. Then a couple of housekeepers complained that any time they hung the new resident's laundry in the closet, the door would slam shut again before they could close it themselves. One said that she was just mopping on the other side of the room when the door threw itself open and then shut. Before long, almost everyone working there had witnessed this closet door banging open or shut with no one's assistance. They all seemed to find it interesting and novel at first, but before long, everyone was pretty annoyed with it. Mama said a few of them went into the room and asked Nellie or Thomas to please stop, and the reply was always the door slamming itself open or closed, sometimes in rapid succession. They even called a preacher at one point to pray, but even he was met with only the slamming closet door for all his efforts. They moved the new resident out of the room because she wasn't able to rest at that door. Then one day, my mama and one of her fellow nurses were chatting about that closet door over their lunch, and it occurred to them that the big change was the lack of birdseed in the closet to keep the feeders filled. After work that day, Mama stopped on her way home and bought a bag, and the next day she opened it up and put it in that closet. Sure enough, the closet didn't open or close on its own, and the bird feeders were refilled regularly. As an experiment, they let the new bag run out and didn't replace it at first. The closet door started back to misbehaving, and when they put a new bag of birdseed in, all was quiet. From then on, they all took turns making sure the supply never ran out, and they never had to hear the slamming closet door again. The feeders would be full, and no one knew how, but any resident who lived in that room after always had 2 full feeders and birds outside their window. Ghost/paranormal experiences, my own and from people I know. Ignore how this is composed like a novel. I'm an author. Don't let it make these stories seem made up. These are all real. Names have all been replaced, and I am telling the stories from a third-person perspective, including my own experiences, at the request of the people involved in these stories. This is a mix of stories that I've been told and that I've experienced firsthand, some wholesome and some just downright creepy. Pull up a chair and a hot cup of tea and enjoy. Jane and John lived together in a home with their daughter, Laura. Jane and John would always be hearing things, Laura would always be seeing things, and the fire alarm would always go off in the middle of the night. Every night after Laura went to bed, after Jane had read her a story, and after she'd heard her parents get into bed, she'd always get up to get a glass of water from the bathroom. She remembers one night, listening for her parents to get in bed, then getting up and opening her door to see that it was daylight. She looked and saw John standing in his bedroom doorway, and he told her good morning. She stood there, confused as hell, because, to her, no time had passed. She'd just gone to bed about 30 seconds earlier. The day just went along as usual. Laura would always see dark figures bolting past doorways. She'd even try to chase them. Whenever she saw them, she'd run after them and not find anything, then run and tell Jane and John that she saw Darth Sidious run across a doorway. Jane and John believed her because they too had seen something similar, but they told her it was just her eyes playing tricks on her in order to keep her calm. Jane would get up for work at 6 in the morning every weekday. One morning, she saw a figure standing under the tree on their front lawn. It was glowing faintly blue and was wearing a long white cloak. It was tall, had an elongated face, and appeared to be mumbling something. She stared right at it for a good minute and walked to her car briskly, not breaking eye contact with it. Once she was in her car, she called John and told him to come out and see it. He came out, and he saw nothing. He wasn't in disbelief, however, as he'd also experienced strange things in that house. One night, they were sitting in the living room at night, sharing a bottle of wine and watching TV. In unison, their eyes followed a black figure, which passed swiftly by the windows. First the kitchen window, then the back door. They both saw it and looked at each other, confirming that they were indeed seeing what they were seeing. John would also hear footsteps sliding across the carpet in the basement while home alone. John frantically ran around the house one day because he could hear a tap running. I don't know whether or not he had found the running tap, nor does he remember this specific incident. When John was small, his grandmother passed away. Some days after her death, at her funeral, he asked her to come and visit and to move something in his room if he happened to be asleep. Later that night, while John was asleep, he opened his eyes, only for a moment, to see a small Garfield figurine floating past his bedroom window. He'd assumed it was only a dream, but sure enough, when he woke up, the figurine was sitting right there in his lap. He still has the figurine and keeps it safe to this day. The same night John's grandmother passed, his sister, Bethany, was visited by her grandmother in a dream. Her grandmother had told Bethany that she was very cold. When Jane's father, Eric, passed away, her cousin, Vera, had a dream. During Vera's childhood, Eric was like a father to her. Vera dreamt that Eric had come to visit her to comfort her. The next day, Vera called Jane to ask if everything was all right with Eric and received the news of his passing. While driving to Eric's funeral, Jane, John, Jane's sister Nancy, and her husband Daniel were in the car. Jane was driving. The highway was extremely icy, and it was snowing heavily. Jane, devastated by her father's passing, was crying and was unable to see the road clearly through her teary eyes in all the snow. Suddenly, the volume on the radio began to increase, slowly, to an almost deafening level. Then slowly, it came back down. When Jane and Nancy were small, Eric would do this to the car stereo while driving if Jane and Nancy were making too much noise in the back seats, distracting him. At first, Jane thought either John or Daniel had the stereo remote and were just playing some sick joke, but the remote was tucked away in the glove compartment. Jane felt comfort, knowing her father was still there to protect her from danger. Some years later, Eric's brother, Mark, passed away. Jane, John, Nancy, Daniel, and Laura attended. While at the funeral, John felt an extremely strong and evil presence, as if it were something threatening or attacking Mark. John believes he has a very strong connection to his past lives in the spirits he encountered. When John was an infant, he would often cry out at night, as most babies do. His parents, Rose and Bob, brought him to a temple to have the demons removed from him. After the temple visit, he never cried out at night again. John believes he has been crying out at night because of his past life. In his past life, he was a monk. He believes that he had evil spirits trapped within him because of this, and that those spirits were removed upon his visit to the temple. Daniel's father passed recently, and while visiting his father's house shortly after he passed, he noticed that the clock in the kitchen had stopped the exact moment he died, and a yellow canary watched him through the window of every room he entered. When Jane was starting her career as a nurse, she worked in a nursing home. An elderly woman on her deathbed had not had the strength to speak or move for an entire week. Then, one day, while Jane was in the room with her, she sat up and asked for a glass of water. She then looked up into the corner of the room and had the warmest smile on her face. Jane asked her what she was looking at. The woman told Jane she was looking at the Virgin Mary. The woman was in total bliss when Jane brought her the glass of water, and she succumbed over old age within an hour. Laura's close friend, Jonas, unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. Jonas had taken his own life in the basement of his home. For the months after Jonas's death, Laura had been receiving silent phone calls from Jonas's number. She'd pick up the phone and hear silence before the call ended. She'd also hear more of Jonas's favorite songs on the radio, or they would shuffle more frequently in her playlist. These were songs that he would often sing over the phone. These occurrences stopped about 5 months after Jonas's death. In Laura's current home, not her childhood home, she has seen lights turning on by themselves, items mysteriously falling off shelves, and doors closing on their own. To Laura, these occurrences are not frequent enough to be considered hauntings. She believes they are simply spirits passing through the area, not intending to cause any harm, and not staying in her home. I will continue to add to this collection. Haunted by a cloaked shadow figure. I thought I would share a small collection of paranormal experiences I've had over the years, namely 2 specific incidents, both of which were somewhat ongoing for a time. I've always had a bit of what I call a spooky meter. I don't really have any better word for it than that. There have been times I will walk into a room and get a very unsettling feeling, and generally, I seem to visually perceive it differently. Things will generally appear darker and dimmer than they ought to, as if light is swallowed. As a bit of an example of my spooky radar going off even in an exterior environment, I'm from Australia. And a couple years ago, I traveled to Cairns for work and met up with some people who worked for the same organization in a branch in far north Queensland. One of these whom I spent the most time with happened to be Aboriginal, and in our time off, she took me to a few touristy places. One of these went by a rock pool, and I instantly got a horrible feeling. Despite the fact that it was a sunny day, the sunlight appeared dull, dim, and gray, kind of like that scene from LTR when Frodo and Sam are traversing the mountains at the start of the Two Towers. I remember instinctively turning to her and saying, "This is a bad place." Her eyes lit up, and she immediately began telling me that this was an area that had a lot of drownings, and that there is an old Aboriginal legend about a male and female from 2 separate tribes who fell in love for reasons I'm not qualified to speak on. Taboo. I'm probably going to butcher the story, so I do apologize. But in short, they were both punished and killed by that rock pool, and it is said that her angry sword remains there and holds anyone that comes there under the water. There's actually a super scary story about one case in which the local news took a photo of the spot after a man drowned there and published it in the newspaper. In the photo, the rocks formed the shape of the man's face, which is super creepy. I tried to hunt down the photo, but I couldn't for the life of me find out, so you will have to just take my word for it or do your own research. As far as the drownings go, there is actually a scientific reason for this that I'm not familiar with that you can look up if you like. However, Aboriginals have a rich storytelling history. I'm conscious not to misrepresent a rich and fascinating culture that doesn't get enough attention and love in Australia. This is just what I'd been taught. I think there's actually some truth in a lot of these. And I know people on here like Wendigo stories. Some indigenous tribes have a version of the Bendigo, although I'm not familiar with it. Sorry for the long foreplay. Time for the story. In my childhood home, which was built by my parents, so not a case of someone died here and haunts it, a fact my unbelieving father regularly tells me even to this day when my siblings and I repeat this story, we had a spare room, which always gave me the creeps toward the back of the house at the end of a long hallway. I should also mention we liked a farm fairly far from town, and on it I've had a number of creepy experiences, but none like the ones I'm going to mention. I should also say that my father has lived in the house since his mid-20s, along with a few housemates, one of whom used to claim that the house was haunted. The only story my non-believing father told me that he couldn't explain was that the stereo system, which was unplugged, began blasting music in the early hours of the morning. Firstly, when I was extremely young, perhaps too young to recall this, but it has always been a core memory for me, I was awoken in my room by something I thought to be my father. I don't remember seeing him or what he looked like, only that I was lifted from my cot and put on the floor. He had large feet, and our hallway had a wooden floor. I remember crawling after him and following the imprints his barefoot made on the floor until we got to the kitchen. "Let's have ice cream," he said to me. He lifted me to the freezer, which was way too high for me to reach, and I grabbed the ice cream and began to eat it. It was dark at the time, and when the sun began to rise, my dad came back downstairs. I remember him asking me what I was doing and taking the ice cream off of me. I told him I was eating the ice cream and that he had taken me to get it. He had absolutely no idea what I was talking about and said he absolutely did not wake me up in the middle of the night to get me some ice cream. When I brought it up with him now as a young adult, he says he remembers it and claims I must have climbed it. There is absolutely no way I could have climbed it. When I was perhaps 4 or 5, I recall playing with my brother and 2 sisters at the end of the hallway opposite the room. We saw a black hooded figure that was blurry and smoky, if you like, depiction attached at the end of the story. It ran past us at a ridiculous speed and went into the spare room, slamming the door behind it. We all screamed and carried on, and then, I guess, forgot about it and put it down to being young and overly imaginative. Despite this, however, we never entered that room if we didn't have to, and would always close the door and or turn the light on in there, only to find the door open and the light off whenever we went back. Could have been our parents. That all changed when I was 12. My brother, who was 2 years older than me, and I had shared a room for our whole childhood. When my brother transitioned to high school, my parents thought it best that we have our own rooms as he was staying up later, and I'm sure puberty also played a role. I was moved into the spare room, which, as I'd gotten older, sort of gotten over my fear of. It was a simple room, fairly small and square. My bed was situated in the bottom left-hand corner of the room, and a desk ran along the wall beside it toward the door, which I mostly used for building Lego. The far left corner had a big-ass wooden wardrobe, which I never used. A window sat on the wall facing the door that never seemed to let enough light in despite its size, and the entire right-hand side of the room was just a giant cupboard with sliding doors. My walls were also covered in posters, which is important to note. I spent anywhere from 2 weeks to a month in hell when I first moved into that room. From the get-go, my spooky radar went pretty haywire, and I didn't really like being in there. I will do my best to recount the incidences that I remember, although there aren't a lot. For reference, I spent every night of that initial month in there unable to sleep and battling all manner of strange occurrences. There are probably like 21 nights worth of scary incidences, most of which I can't recall and probably deliberately tried to forget. The first occurrences were fairly tame. I used to have a pedestal fan running most nights that created a pretty heavy white noise. Because of it, I can't really confirm whether what I heard was real or not, but initially I thought I could hear whispering throughout the night. It used to put me super on edge, especially since it was just faint enough that I couldn't discern if I was crazy or not. So already my sleep started getting pretty bad. Then things started to get worse. My floor was carpeted, and I would begin to hear that soft sort of crumpling sound you hear when someone's walking on it. The footsteps were slow, and would always come toward me, coming from the wardrobe in the corner of the room. Strangely, most things would occur in the wardrobe in the corner. I remember I initially had a lamp in my room, which I would turn on as soon as I heard anything. But after way too little time, the bulb blew, and the lamp never worked again, no matter how many bulbs we put in it. I transitioned to using my iPod for a light, then one of those torch apps, which I always kept by my side. It became necessary for me to sleep facing the door, as every time I did finally get to sleep, if I was facing the wall, I would get a horrific nightmare. Sometimes I would fall asleep facing the door, have a nightmare, and wake up to find that I had rolled over in the night. I began to wake up periodically in the night to strange noises. Things would move around or fall off shelves. This was actually trackable and began to truly confirm my strong suspicion that something was amiss. I'm not Christian, but I am open-minded, and despite my lack of belief, God plays a part in the story. Strangely, I began to wake at 3 a.m., which is known as the witching hour. I didn't know this until I consulted the resident spooky expert of my school, whom we will call James for the sake of the story. He was just a kid who had seen way too many horror movies. James told me that my room was likely haunted and that I should try to record it through the night. So I set my iPod up to charge overnight and used a voice recorder app to record the sounds during the night. I tried video first, but my phone would overheat and die too quickly, and I probably wouldn't have had enough storage space for an 8-hour recording anyway. Old technology wasn't as capable as it is now. But strangely, the recordings would always stop at random intervals as though someone had pressed stop. I had a passcode, so that was impossible, so those amounted to nothing. Things got worse again. One day I felt as though my duvet was moving, and I didn't think much of it because it used to fall down the side of my bed because of its weight sometimes. This time it felt as though it were rising, and before I could really clock it, a hand touched my back. It wasn't freezing cold like in the movies, nor did it burn me or anything like that. It just felt like a human hand planted itself on my back. I recoiled naturally and probably spent the rest of the night with the light on. From then on, I used to tuck my blanket underneath my body, which was a habit I maintained until I was like 18, thanks to that experience. Another time, my blanket felt like it was falling down the bed again, so I grabbed it and went to pull it back, but it didn't move. Initially, I thought it was stuck on something, but no matter how hard I pulled, it didn't move. That's when the blanket was pulled back. I remember my heart fucking racing. I essentially played tug of war with a fucking ghost for 30 seconds before it let up, and I flew backward with the blanket, having been pulling on it with all my strength and going back and forth prior to it. After that, I remember things getting borderline awful, and I basically didn't sleep ever. I spoke to James about it and how things seemed to be getting worse. I was outright terrified now, and he speculated that it may be feeding on my fear and growing stronger with each passing night. This notion obviously horrified me, and I asked him what I could do. He actually suggested I pray, funnily enough, and told me a few things I could say that had worked in some horrors he'd seen. I don't remember the order of operations, but what I do know is that one night things were especially bad. Whispering, objects moving around and falling, strange noises, and footsteps. I couldn't take it anymore, and so I prayed. I prayed that I would be given the strength and courage to face the thing, and I prayed that whatever was in my room would go fuck off back to wherever it came from. I recall this next part perfectly and will likely never forget it. I sat up in bed and yelled, "In the name of God, I banish you from my room." I remember raising my fist as though I were prepared to fight it with my bare hands. I think my courage was fueled by the belief that God was on my side. From the corner of my room rushed the same hooded black figure I saw in my childhood. It was like a misty blur. It moved so quickly that it generated a wind that swept across the room as it ran, blowing off all my posters and knocking over the Lego on my desk, which smashed on the floor. It rushed to the exit of my room and stopped in the doorway. I remember it turning and looking at me for only about half a second, but what gave me chills was the speed at which it moved. In its time, I dare say it stared a lot longer than that. I remember I fell asleep after that in pure exhaustion, and I slept like a fucking baby. When I woke up, I thought I had imagined or dreamt the whole thing, but when I looked around my room, the thing was fucking trashed. So badly that I remember my dad coming in and telling me it looked like a hurricane had passed through it. He didn't believe me when I told him what happened. I think he believed that I believed it, but some people, I guess, just have never had an experience and therefore refuse to buy into it whenever someone else tells a story. That's fair enough, I suppose. Nothing happened after that. I never forgot about what occurred, and it even made me a devout Christian for like 12 months. The only thing that occurred involving whatever the thing was came when I was about 15. We had what used to be a toy/play room that got converted into a gym room with a treadmill and bench plus a kid's computer room. I was working out in it one day while my sister was playing on the computer. I remember she looked over my shoulder and screamed. She said she saw a black hooded figure behind me, that it was blurry and hazel like it was made of smoke, that it was watching me, and that it ran away when she screamed. That was the last time I'd ever seen it. It's funny though, because a lot of people apparently have seen the cloaked bastard during sleep paralysis. That's how I found the photo below though. But I know I was awake when I saw it, and if you can't believe me, then believe my siblings. I've known a ghost since childhood. I've been wanting to share some experiences myself and my family have had, dating all the way back to the mid-1990s. For quick context, I am the oldest of 4 sons, and we all grew up in this house. It's a small, 3-bedroom home in a quiet subdivision surrounded by wilderness. My parents bought it in 1982 and still live there today. I come from a superstitious and some would call sensitive family. Most seem to be in tune with our extrasensory perception. In no way do I consider myself to be a psychic or someone with extremely good precognition or clairvoyance, but I do feel like I have been aware of unexplainable presences or feelings. Now let's get into the story. My mother explained to me that before she became pregnant with me, she never really noticed any strange or paranormal occurrences at home. When my mom got pregnant, she said things changed. At this point, she started feeling a presence while at home. My father's work at the time had him gone for a week at a time, and my mom found herself feeling lonely and overthinking. At night, while trying to sleep, she felt like someone was in the room with her. She said it wasn't ominous or negative energy, but the opposite. As her pregnancy continued, small objects started vanishing and showing back up. She bought wind-up toys and toys that were activated by buttons. She placed them on a shelf in a closet. They ended up on the closet floor, activated, and playing. She says she saw a female figure move from one room to another in the upstairs halls. At that point, she wanted to understand why the house had all this paranormal energy. But the house was newly built, not even 20 years old at the time. The previous owner was a single parent, but she never knew the age or gender of the children. My mom started having complications with her pregnancy, and I was born 9 weeks premature. I spent the first 6 months of my life in the hospital, dealing with issue after issue. But I managed to pull through. I know this isn't related to the paranormal, but it's important context for later events and theories. There was a time when I was a few months old when a pair of hats my mother and great-grandmother wore to a wedding somehow got moved from the attic storage into my mom's closet. It spooked my mom momentarily, but by then she had come to terms with the fact that she was sharing space with some sort of friendly spirit, ghost, or presence. These things didn't bother her too much. But besides that, not much else happened. One of the strangest but most powerful things that happened in my childhood home took place when I was still very young. You see, even though I was 8 months old, I still couldn't roll myself over very well or sit up. Embarrassing? Sure, but what could I do? I was just a baby. Anyway, my mom was home alone again with me. She put me down for a nap and went to lay down in her bedroom across the hall. She was quite tired, so sleep took over quickly. She says that she had a vivid dream. She was in some sort of white room. It was bright. She was sort of standing in place. She felt someone enter the space with her. It was a welcoming presence, one she felt before, but a more ominous feeling showed up, like impending doom, or that feeling when you just know something isn't right. And then she heard the voice of a girl. It told her, "The baby. It's the baby." The voice repeated itself as she jolted awake. She sensed something was wrong. She rushed across the hall, which, luckily, was only a mere 7 feet or so into my bedroom. I somehow had myself face down on the crib mattress. I must have decided it was time to move myself around, but I was clearly unable to push my face out of the mattress. Ask my mom this story now, and she'll tell you with great detail how real the dream felt and how scary it all was. As I got older, I was told to be around 3 or 4. I started chatting with an imaginary friend. I would spend a lot of time sitting up in my room, stationed on my floor with all sorts of toys. I would be having full-on conversations, apparently, with no one. When my parents asked me who I was talking to, I told them her name was Tara. I told them she was a little girl a bit older than me. I said she was nice. I didn't let this up for years, I'd been told. I can remember understanding at a young age, maybe 8 or 9, that our house had spirits in it. But I was raised and told that they were harmless, that they were just here with us. And I felt it too. I didn't mind it. Honestly, it didn't scare me. What scared me instead were sudden, loud noises and movies about vampires. Fast forward to my teenage years now. I was sleeping on a Friday night. Across from my bed was a large dresser, and pushed beside it was a longer but shorter dresser. It was tall and sturdy enough that a young person could hop up on it and sit. I remember coming out of a strange dream, and I started to wake up. I opened my eyes, and they were met with someone else's gaze. It was a young girl, dark hair and clothes that looked like they were from decades prior. She was sitting up on my dresser, looking at me. I jumped out of bed because, honestly, who expects that? Now, was she scary looking? No. I believe it was Tara. I've seen her a few other times, or possibly another female spirit. I come home to visit my parents, and at times I get the same intense feeling. It's very hard to explain. It's just like I know that one of these spirits is around, and they're welcoming me back. I'll walk into the house, especially if I'm the first to arrive home, and the whole feel of my surroundings changes. It's hard to explain, but I have come to learn it's the type of feeling I get when Tara is around. When I'm spending time alone at the house, especially downstairs in the basement, I'll see a dark, female figure move across the back of the room, the shape of the body reflecting off the glass paneling of my parents' bar. It'll move into the laundry room and disappear. I've seen it in reflections of windows upstairs, standing in various spots around the home, as if they are just sharing space with me, as if they are just trying to say hi. I'm older now. I just turned 30, but in all the apartments I've lived in, I've had paranormal experiences. Nothing horrifying, thank goodness, but I always seem to have something happen, and I'm okay with it. Maybe I'll share some of those moments another time. I would be lying to you if I tried to make my story sound like some horrid, poltergeist haunting with objects thrown and evil lurking around. But I truly believe not all aspects of the paranormal are spooky and scary. Sometimes they are strange, but they're wholesome. The experiences can be enlightening. Maybe we do share our lives with others who have passed on and who just want to make themselves aware from time to time. Maybe to watch over us. Who knows? It's all complex, but I do believe that I have had ghosts follow me around all my life. My boyfriend talks in his sleep. This is an actual, true story about what happened in December. I didn't think about posting the story here until just now, but here I am sharing it. For the sake of anonymity, places and names will be switched out. My boyfriend and I have been together for over 2 years now. When this occurred, we had also been living together in an apartment for almost a year. I will refer to him as John and myself as Jane. One thing about my boyfriend is that he is. I wouldn't call him psychic or a medium. Both he and some of his family just have the ability to feel their presence. Something that no one can see or hear, but he and his other relatives can just notice. This was prevalent a lot in the first apartment we lived in, as the place was quite old. John would feel some type of energy in the apartment every now and then. Since I'm a person who can get quite spooked, I quickly told him to save the stories of the presences he could pick up until we had moved out of there. Kindly enough of him, he did. John has shared some of the details after we moved away from there, and they were pretty creepy, in my opinion. When we then moved into our current apartment, which was built pretty recently, John could confirm that he did not feel any of those energies in there. I was relieved by this, as I'm sure you can understand. Another thing about John is that he talks in his sleep. It happens about once a week, as far as I'm aware. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, but I can sometimes wake up to him talking nonsense or giggling out of nowhere. It's usually just a sentence, if even that. Sometimes it's just a word or two. I have tried several times to record him in his sleep, but so far I have had no luck with that plan. With all of this information shared, let me tell you the story that led me to write this in the first place. In the beginning of December, me, John, and my dad decided to go visit my grandma. I hadn't seen her for quite some time, and she lives about a 2-hour drive away from us. And my grandma has this doll. She's called Rebecca. It's a regular plastic doll with blonde hair and is the size of a small child. When I was growing up, my dad would tell me these stories of Rebecca the doll. Stories about her making things move places when he was home alone as a kid. I had, of course, shared these stories with John, and we would laugh at them. As a woman in her early 20s, I wouldn't say that I was scared of Rebecca. I'm not even sure if I believe the stories that my dad told me. But having seen a lot of horror movies, many of them containing dolls, I had grown to respect Rebecca. There is no need to provoke her, just to stay on the safe side. When visiting my grandma, I, of course, needed to show John the doll. She's placed in the corner of my grandma's bedroom, so me and John went in there. Out of nowhere, John decides to flip his finger at Rebecca. I instantly felt panic and told John to apologize to Rebecca to be on the safe side. John said no, laughed it off, and left the room. I quickly followed. I didn't want to be left alone in the room with that doll, especially after what had just happened. We returned home that same night, neither of us talking about the doll for the rest of that day. I had honestly forgotten about it already, since we also decided to visit my cousins who lived in the same town as my grandma. Me and John went to sleep around midnight. Despite being a heavy sleeper, my boyfriend falls asleep before I do most nights. This happened that night as well. I remember that I was just about to fall asleep, but John nudged me with his elbow as if he were looking for me. He said Jane several times. I gave up on ignoring him and asked what he wanted. "What are you doing?" he said. I asked him what he meant. "Why are you standing there in the corner?" He responded. I instantly got chills down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked back. "Yes, you're there in the corner. Why are you staring at me?" He replied. The room was pitch black. If there were indeed someone standing in the corner of the room, there is no way either of us could have seen it. "No, what are you talking about?" "I'm lying next to you," I responded, terrified at this point. "Oh, right, okay," he said. Then he was quiet again, sleeping heavily. I felt ridiculous taking my phone and pointing the flashlight towards the corners of the room. Of course, I would not see anything, but just knowing that my boyfriend had felt something with us in the room was enough for me to barely get any sleep that night. When waking up the next morning, John had no recollection of what had happened during the night. When I told him, he laughed at me and apologized for ruining my sleep. At first, I thought he was lying, that the whole thing had been a prank just to scare me. But John is a terrible liar, and I know he was honest about him having slept through the whole thing. For Christmas, we went back to my grandma. I went back into her bedroom, and I apologized to Rebecca on behalf of John and myself. Nothing similar has happened since. I have shared this story with friends and family, all of whom have thought it was funny. I just can't shake the feeling that it was actually Rebecca's presence in our bedroom that night. We had upset her, and she followed us home. Only I knew. I've always wanted to share this story, but it's hard to get across the severity of the environment to really hit home. But it changed my perspective entirely and immediately. I was in basic army training. At some point in the cycle, an employee of a company came to your battalion to talk to you about t-shirt designs. Not important, but what's important is that somehow it happened that I had a second alone with an older employee, which is really not allowed. You always need to have someone with you. But it just happened while I was waiting. So we were talking, and he started to tell me that the buildings have changed so much since he started. There is an indoor staircase with a door straight into every bay, the bug opening room where you sleep with your company or gender. He said that the inside of that stairway higher up used to be open just like the bottom, but they added walls all the way up because one year, a trainee jumped and committed suicide, like 10 plus years ago. Now, suicides in general aren't anything new. It's not special news. In fact, when I was in basic, someone at another fort did just that. Regardless, I made the decision right then to keep that to myself. The place was creepy enough, and everyone was stressed enough. That's the important part. I watched this man come to the barracks and leave. I was the only one alone with him at any point. I told no one what he said to me. I let it go. Sometime later, probably a week or two later, I was on fire guard. Fire guard is basically a night shift with one other person for 1 hour before you wake up the next pair. One person cleans, and one person watches the door. If you're familiar with basic, you can skip this paragraph. If you're not, this is some important information to explain why this was so crazy to me. When the lights are off, you do not go anywhere. You're not allowed to leave the bays on your own accord during the day, much less at night. That is grounds for an immediate kick out of the cycle. You cannot make a noise, you can't be up writing letters, and you can't be sitting and counting the ceiling times. You're in bed, and you're so exhausted that you want to be. If you have to go to the bathrooms, which are connected to the bays, you go to the fire guard desk person and write your name down. It's absolutely silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. You can hear everything in the building. Periodically through the cycle, the drill sergeant on duty at night will check the bays and ask for your accountability. Because it's so quiet, you can hear him coming the second he moves on the ground floor. So, the ghost part. I was in the back sweeping for a while before going to switch out with the desk person. When I get there, she immediately tells me, I don't want to be alone. I'm freaked out. I ask why, of course, and she tells me, I keep hearing noises. I thought it was the drill sergeant, but I haven't heard a single door open. I keep hearing footsteps and then the sound of something falling. When I told you in that moment that I entirely understood the phrase, my heart dropped. I didn't know what to say. Footsteps and the sound of something falling? That is so incredibly specific. To be hearing noises at all is honestly weird, but the sound of something falling? Repeatedly? No one in their right mind would sneak out in the middle of the night just to make noise. And even if they did, she would have absolutely heard a noise. It just freaked me out so bad that I can't ever describe it. What else could I think? What else could I make of it? Neither of us left each other's side that night. After this incident, I did tell her about the suicide. She did not know. Even now, I know it doesn't sound that crazy, but I just can't get across how strict this environment was. I'm sure anyone reading this is going to think, someone snuck out of the bays. The drill sergeant was bored. I just can't communicate how quiet that place is at night or how audible the staircase and doors are. And I forgot to tack on, the main staircase in question was only used by the females and drill sergeants. The males had to use the smaller individual ones. If a male did sneak out, the female staircase is the absolute last place you'd want to be making noise. You'd be packed out of the cycle in a nanosecond. And yes, it had cameras. I've never been able to make sense of it, and I don't think I will. I was the only one who talked to that man. I think it would have been better if I were the one sitting at the desk. I could have convinced myself that I was just scaring myself. And I just want to add this on since I'm here. Another ghost story from Basic, but it's much smaller. Me and the other fire guard trainee were both sitting at the desk, slacking off. Remember how I mentioned that if you want to go to the bathroom, you have to sign your name in and out? That was because we had to report on people in the bathroom and not currently in bed too. 1. No one signed to go to the bathroom. 2. The lights in the bathroom stay on no matter what, so if the door is opened, you'll see a huge flash of light. Believe me, it's obnoxious enough to start multiple arguments with the people close to it. 3. As mentioned, the place is horribly quiet. So imagine how freaked out we were when there was just, out of nowhere, the most comical drawn-out creak of the stall door slowly swinging open or shut. We immediately look at each other, saying nothing. We wait for someone to move, for someone to come out, for the sink to turn on. It never happens. The stall door just decided to do a full rotation on its own. It was not a squeak. It was a very pronounced, long ee-hee-ee, exactly like you hear in bad horror movies. No, the bathrooms did not have a single window. The bays did, but they in fact did not open at all. There was no wind, but if it were some mysterious gust from a vent, it would not have managed to slowly move a single stall door all the way open. This one does get to me, but at the end of the day, it's a generic things that go bump in the night story. The warnings. Due to the nature of my job, I will be changing the names of everyone involved in and or affected by one of the most terrifying nights I have ever had. The things I'm about to share actually happened to me one night while at work. I am what's known as a personal care attendant or direct support worker. I work one-on-one with a disabled client. My client at the time was around 29 years old and had been in a freak accident 3 years prior. He was accidentally shot in the neck by a stray bullet when he was sitting outside on his grandpa's porch, leaving him quadriplegic. I have worked for him for many years. He lived in my cousin's home with his 4 daughters. At that time, I worked from 5 p.m. to 7 a.m. while my cousin was at work. I do everything my client is unable to do, from housework to cooking to daily tasks he needs help with, as well as taking care of his 4 kids. After I put all the kids to bed and got Nate settled for the night, I went through the house and made sure all the lights were turned off and all the doors were locked. They had a security system as well, but for some reason I forgot to arm it at that time. It was about 10 o'clock at night when I went to my cousin's bedroom to watch a movie on my laptop before going to sleep. About an hour into the movie, I headed to the kitchen for something to drink. It was dark, but I am used to the layout and didn't bother turning the lights on. When I heard a sound coming from the front door, I didn't immediately recognize it. It was the doorknob rattling. I have experienced a lot of paranormal activity over the years in this house, and I peeked out to see if anyone was at the door and saw no one. So I assumed it was just that. I checked all the doors and windows, made sure everyone was okay, and went back to the bedroom to finish my movie. After about 10 minutes, my laptop started acting up. It froze and was making a really strange, high-pitched noise I'd never heard before. I restarted it, and it did it again. I shrugged it off, decided I was getting tired anyway, and thought about going to bed. I started to lie down when I heard footsteps in the hallway heading in the direction of the kids' room and the bedroom I was in, so I got up, flipped the hall light on, and peeked out the door into the hallway. No one. But I again walked through the house, checking on everybody and making sure everything was locked up. I started feeling very anxious at this point and knew I wouldn't be able to sleep now, so I turned the TV on and the volume down so I wouldn't disturb anyone when I heard a very familiar voice say my name. It sounded exactly like my dad, except my dad passed away nearly 10 years prior to this. I sat up and looked around the room. Again, no one. Now I'm thinking I'm not going to sleep at all. The activity was kicking up more than usual, so I decided to use the voice recorder to figure out what was going on. I captured the voice of a young boy. My client's children are all girls. After asking some questions, it sounded like he said, "You need to be careful." I tried to ask more questions, but I was so tired. Out of the corner of my eye, in the reflection of the large picture frame, I saw something move. I also heard the movement and turned to look. I couldn't see anything in front of me, but I swear to God I could see my uncles, who had passed a few years prior, reflection in the glass of the picture frame. Then I heard him say, "You can't go to sleep." I'm a paranormal investigator, and not a lot freaks me out, but I'd never experienced this kind of activity before. It was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and almost 3 hours of constant, unexplained activity. I decided I'd had enough, and I walked over to the nightstand, grabbed the remote to arm the security system, pushed the button to arm it, and thought, this is crazy, I need to just try to get some sleep. I had to be up in a few hours to get the girls ready for school. I stuck my knee on the bed, and at that exact moment someone kicked in the back door to the house, which was located in the kitchen, and the security system went off. It was extremely loud, and lights were flashing all over the outside of the house. I grabbed my phone and ran toward the open back door. I didn't see anyone and dialed 911. One of my biggest fears is someone breaking in, and as I was on the phone, I was checking to make sure everyone was all right and there wasn't anyone actually in the house. My cousin called because the security system company had called him because of the alarm being triggered, and he had told them it was probably an accident. I told him to call them back. Someone just kicked your fucking back door in, and I'm not turning this alarm system off until the police get here. We never found out it tried to break into the house, but you cannot convince me that all the paranormal activity I experienced that night was not a warning about what was going to happen that night. It was truly as if they were purposely doing things to get my attention, so I wouldn't forget to set that alarm by keeping me awake. I'm not really afraid of the paranormal, it's the living that I tend to worry about. And this is a perfect example of that. What was haunting my Nana's home? When I was a kid, my Nana lived in an old, historical house built sometime around the 1920s on a street called Elgen. It was a 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-story house that was painted red with white trim. As I'm researching this home, some 15 plus years from the last time I was there, I've learned that the home is considered historical in its city, and the woman who owned it was an Oklahoma historical figure. For privacy reasons, I will leave out details on the original homeowner and other information on the home so that the property can stay protected. If you figure it out, don't be an ass and go there. It's boarded up anyway. Continuing on, when my Nana rented the home, she was living with her boyfriend, her youngest daughter, my aunt, and several pets. The only two of which I can recall are a pug named Pugsley, a gray cat called Chinley, and a Siamese cat named Taterbug. Taterbug was a jerk, but I adored him nonetheless. There were, of course, several other pets, but my memory is hazy. Taterbug is the only one, that I know of, who plays a big part in the happenings at the Elgen house. I don't remember the layout of the inside of the house much, but I remember we entered through the back door usually, and there was a staircase between the kitchen and dining area that led upstairs. Past the dining room was a large living room with a bay window and the front door. The room was divided in half, with an old double door in the center that led to the other side of the living room and a hallway leading to my aunt's room and a bathroom, I believe. I have no memory of what was upstairs except for the master bedroom closet that spanned the length of the entire upstairs area. I think there may have been a small office upstairs because I feel as though my Nana's boyfriend at the time kept war memorabilia from his father in a room upstairs. That is the best way I can describe the interior. First, I would like to say that an experience widely felt by many of my family members was that if you wanted to go up the stairs, you would feel hands pushing you up. The staircase was an L shape, so as kids would normally grab something to sit on and slide down the two sections, but any time we walked up, it was like two hands were pressing on our shoulder blades, ushering us. When asking my older brother what he recalled from the home, he said, "Elgen never did anything to me. It seemed to like me, you, and our cousin for some reason." Shifting focus to my aunt, who lived there at the time, she said that her cat, Chinley, seemed possessed while they lived there, and that she perched on the ledge till she was so exhausted she'd fall asleep and fall off. She lost so much weight. Though I believe Chinley made it to the next house just fine and lived a happy rest of her life, Taterbug was also subjected to whatever was in the home, tormenting him. As a kid, I hated Taterbug because he was a mean little guy, but later in life, I realized he was a sweet cat, and that house may have provoked him more than I thought. Before I get to Taterbug's tale, I feel that it's worth mentioning a few more stories. Like the time that my aunt one day called her mom, my Nana, hysterical and said that someone was bouncing a bowling ball upstairs. Of course, when my Nana got him, that was exactly what it sounded like, a bowling ball being dropped from the top floor, that they never knew what caused it. At some point, my Nana and her boyfriend stopped sleeping upstairs. I don't know how soon that happened, but I know that all of my memories have them downstairs, in the second half of the living room. Either their bed or a couch was against the double doors, so they kept them shut and locked and slept there. I remember watching Jeepers Creepers in that house and feeling dread in my stomach, like something was watching with me. My cousins would also watch movies with me there, and more often than not, you could find us playing around outside in the dirt. However, one day, my twin cousins were being babysat by my Nana's boyfriend when they wanted to play hide and seek. It would take a while to find them, though. My Nana's boyfriend was freaking out, and when Nana got home, the girls had been hiding for a while, and the one place they hadn't thought the twins would be was where they found them. The twins were sitting in the very back of that long, dark closet, for God knows how long. There was also an instance where the twins managed to climb on the roof from the window at the top of the stairs when no one was looking, but we are unsure whether or not that has anything to do with the Elgen house or childish curiosity. To finish this story, I'll finally tell you about Taterbug and his experience. Like I mentioned before, Taterbug was a Siamese cat with the most beautiful blue eyes and one hell of a temper. He was fiercely loyal to my Nana and was often present in their downstairs sleeping area. One day, my Nana and her boyfriend are watching TV and hanging out when Taterbug starts to puff up and starts freaking out. Suddenly, he bolts from the room, and they hear a thump in the other part of the living room. When they went to check on what happened, my Nana told me that there had been a framed picture of her boyfriend's dad on the fireplace mantel that now sat face down in the middle of the floor with Taterbug on top, holding it down. He had been losing it over this picture, but when my Nana managed to get him off, they turned the frame over to reveal no damage. There was not a single crack in the glass of the frame. Despite it practically flying across half the room and hitting the floor, it had zero damage. I wonder if they put the photo back or if they left it off of the mantel. I'm not sure. What I do know is that there is undeniably more that happened in the Elgen house. I just haven't had the chance to get more information. The house is boarded up now, and I think my Nana was the last person to live in it. Despite being declared a historical home the last time I saw it, there have seemingly been no efforts in reconstruction. So, what do you think? Perhaps a poltergeist? Or maybe the spirit of the man who fought in a war and whose memorabilia resided in the home? I'm not sure, but what I do know is that whatever it was, I hope it isn't there still. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you didn't enjoy this video, please let me know why down in the comment section below. Thank you for the support. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.